Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcasts co-production recorded on a Wagbical country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show. Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy the show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. Today, I'm joined by Melissa Goode, an Australian writer living in the Blue Mountains. Her work has appeared in Best Australian Short Stories, Griffith Review, Kill Your Darlings, The Pen Review, and Best Small Fictions, among other publications. And one of her short stories has actually been made into a film by the production company Jungle. We're here today to discuss her debut novel, Ordinary Human Love, published by Ultimo Press, which you can get a copy of right now in the description. I started off by asking Melissa about her love of short stories and what the reaction has been like for her debut novel. This book does cover some strong adult themes, so reader discretion is advised. Melissa, welcome to Date with a Debut.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure.
Well, before we dive into Ordinary Human Love, I actually just want to talk about a little bit about the fact that you've written a lot of short stories before you approach this debut novel, if I can. And I have a special case because I believe you have had a short story made into a film.
Yes, I have.
Is pretty freaking insane. I just want to mention that. Like that's a good flex to start off. Like for any writer, tell me about that.
Yeah. Oh, well, it was completely unexpected. So it was a story that was published in Best Australian Stories, and it was when Frank Morehouse was editing it, so that was awesome. And yeah, basically it was out in the world, and then the director, Scott, he came to me, he just contacted me and said, I love your story and I would love to make it into a film. And obviously a short film because it's a short story. And yeah, so this is Scott Pickett, who has since done a lot of work. But it was at the time he was with Jungle Boys, I think, production company. And and it basically just, he worked on the script and we'd signed a contract and everything. And he went and made it into, it actually happened. So, and then we had the screening of it, which was awesome. And I was very heavily pregnant with my daughter. So it was a very strange feeling of seeing this story, come to fruition on film in the cinema. And yeah, it was lovely.
That must have been a strange experience to see your story come to life, and, you know, be birthed in a different setting with a different set of clothes, different to the short story that you had. At the same time, you were also about to have a child of your own.
That's right.
It kind of does feel like a similar experience when you're actually writing a book and then you have to say goodbye to it and it goes out and has a life of its own, similar to a kid in some way, shape or form. But before we talk about Ordinary Human Love, there's one question that I always really like asking when I have come across someone who has written short stories, because I'm quite lucky that I've had a few short story collections on the show this year. Michaela Saunders has been on. Got to chat with John Morrissey at the Newcastle Writers Festival about Firelight, his collection of short stories. And I actually really think, and the reason why I want to poke you about it a little bit further, if I can, is because I feel like short stories are underappreciated in general. I feel like from my own experience, writing short stories is harder than actually writing a novel, because the benefit of a novel is you can be as long and verbose as you wish, whereas brevity is kind of the key point of a short story. And
Yeah.
the chopping and changing and saying a lot within a very set period of time is extremely
Yes.
difficult.
Mm.
As someone who has done a lot of short storytelling, where do you
Mm.
think short stories sits in today's publishing world?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they're completely underappreciated. And I think that's the thing. I think it's hard to get a publishing contract for a collection of short stories because I think the thinking, or at least this is in Australia anyway, I think it's quite different in America, where I think they are far more open to it. But I think here there seems to be a sense that they want readers to be able to dive into a book and to get lost in it. Whereas with a short story, of course, there's an automatic cutoff. It's an opportunity to put the book down and not necessarily read a second story, or certainly not in that sitting. So, and often I think as well, short stories can be incredibly impactful. And sometimes it's actually hard to read 2 short stories in succession because the first one can be so weighty, it can be hard to turn around and then start another one. So I do understand the issue with it. I just think it's unfortunate because I think there's such beauty in the short story. It's sometimes just this perfect slice of life that you don't necessarily get in a novel because it's so much weightier and it's got all these, different agendas and different characters. There is something quite pure about the short story, I think.
So it comes down to like author, like reader experience you think is a major driver, which is surprising to me because personally, I have to read a lot of books and usually you have to run through them as quickly as you can. But when I do like to sit down and really digest stories, and I have found the short story setting quite beneficial. One short story, reading one is enough, and then I can put the book down and come back to it and still keep reading it and still be interested in it, with the themes and topics. I mean, I think it just appealing to different readers' tastes and interests.
Yes.
It's interesting to me that do you think that may change? Do you reckon people will? Do you reckon there's a growing? I've noticed that there has been a growing appreciation for poetry in the last, 12 to 24 months. There's a few more awards coming out. A couple of big books, like I think Drop Bear is the first example by Evelyn Araluen that kind of won a whole bunch of awards. Do you think we'll see that similarly with short stories?
Yeah, I kind of feel like there has been a bit more of a movement towards it, especially if people do the linked short stories, I think, because then you sort of have the option of reading that as a discrete thing, or you can keep going, and it's all flows. And I think there's been an expansion in that kind of area. So I do hope it changes though, because I think, I don't know, to me, they're just so classic. And I think as well, it goes to the skill level of the writer because, like you say, it's such a finite space, and to have to capture that whole world in that little space and to make it really momentous, that takes, I think, a lot of skill. Yeah.
There's so many. I mean, some of my favorite books that got me into reading short stories. I mean, like you only have to look at like Winnie the Pooh when you're younger, or all of the collections, all of those different author stories that come out of it, and they're very fun and playful, and you can pick up one and you can jump from one section to the book of another, and it's so gorgeous. But I digress. From short stories onto a debut novel, let's talk about Ordinary Human Love. And before I ask for a book pitch and we dive headlong into the story itself, book's been out for a month or two, and it's out in the world. It's been doing its own thing. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about this, but what's the reaction been like? Has there been any surprising moments where you've walked into a bookshop in, some random part of the country and gone, "There's my book. It's right there. That's mine."
Yeah. I've actually, it's more been photos, I guess, I've seen from people, if they've been like at airports or some bookstore in somewhere I've never been. That's pretty awesome. Or if they've taken it on holidays with them, that's always nice as well, because you get this footage of the backdrop of where in some exotic location there's your book. So that's a nice feeling. Yeah. But I mean, overall, the reaction's been really positive, and that's been nice. So.
Oh, that's so good to hear. And I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that the reaction has been so positive, because this is a deep dive into the human condition, human experiences, but also how they come into conflict with one another. It's at this part of the show where I like to ask my authors for their 1-minute elevator pitch. And I'm now going
Yeah.
to ask that of you, Melissa. What
Okay.
is Ordinary Human Love about?
Well, it's about Marty, who is a woman in her mid-30s, and it's about her. Really, she's the prodigal daughter returning to Australia after having been away overseas for 18 months, and she's been travelling, drifting, and that followed the death of her mother and the end of her marriage to Richard, and also the end of her affair with Ian. So she had taken herself off to Europe really to, I guess, escape or whatever, recover, however you want to phrase it. And then the story commences with her returning to Australia to her father's house, and realizing in the full knowledge that she needs to repair some relationships, that being particularly with her father and also with her former lover, Ian. That's pretty much the central sort of starting point of the whole novel.
It's a good summary, and I think there's a lot just from that pitch alone for any readers listening. There's a lot to digest and unpack here. It is a great examination of the self, but I also think about the values that you have in your life, and what and how that can sometimes come into conflict with others. I think a lot of people in today's world, we often talk about how, you should always, at the end of the day, you should always look after yourself, and you should always prioritize yourself, and the self-care element of it, of life, is so critical. But sometimes doing that is really difficult because it can be at conflict with other people and other individuals. And the first thing that immediately I was drawn to with this particular book is just the headspace that Marty is in. No spoilers as to who says it, but at a point in this book, someone tells Marty, "You are your own worst enemy." And I thought that really captured a clear headspace of where she is. Not just the fact that she is a person in grief, still dealing with the loss of her mother, but also on the journey she has been on, the situation with Ian, and how that came to its conclusion, but also just where she sits herself. Tell me about her, because she is the lens that you frame everything through.
Yes.
And in this story.
Yeah, well, I think Marty is one of those people who has lived a very privileged life, and has perhaps thought that it would go a particular way, which I think is what a lot of us think. We think we're in control of our lives, and that this step will follow this step, etc. And when something like death happens, or a divorce, or what have you, it can be very destabilizing. And I think people obviously react very differently according to their own grief, because each grief is different. So with her, it automatically became a means of finding escape and solace, and rather than perhaps going towards the people who could help her, instead she ran away. And I mean, there is something in that. I think the sense that the individual, I don't know, that sense of having to hibernate or something, distance yourself.
Yes.
I understand that, yeah. So, but then, of course, on coming back, realizing the world of work that you have to do to make up for what you've done. And I mean, and her father accuses her of, being so selfish in what she did. And I think there is a sense that, in some ways, grief should be a collective experience. I guess it should be but it often isn't. It often divides people, I think, and they go into their own little silos. So yeah.
And I do think that relationship with her father is interesting. How he has processed. The immediate realization I had with her was that after we find out about the death of her mother and how that has led her, is that she really hasn't, the whole idea of distance and trying to rediscover herself. It hasn't prevailed like so many. It's often been like, go away, go travel, go find yourself, and she hasn't really. Instead, she's used it as, I don't want to say like a weapon, in a way, because sometimes you can use distance as a weapon to hide away or disappear from your problems, or hurt other people by depriving them of your presence to deal with something collectively together. And that has certainly been the case with her father, who is particularly when she returns back, is very cold to her, but also that in this kind of this adventures that she's been having, and all of these lives that she's got intertangled with, having that affair with Ian, it breaks down. She's also struck up a relationship with Claudia as well, and that is a very, very that is even itself is a very complicated relationship, and this dives into kind of one of those other key strands that you've weaved through this book, which is the complex nature of love and the complex nature of relationships, and the character. Tell me about particularly Claudia and Ian. I found Ian so interesting because Ian, I mean, in addition to reading the book, I've also seen what other people think of Ian online, and Ian comes across in a very interesting way to many people. But at the same time, you see why he is hurt and he is upset, and there is a reason for the way he is behaving, the way he is behaving. It also comes to a question again of how does one heal from that as well. Just tell me a bit about this setup of the people around Marty.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I first began writing the book, I actually thought of Claudia as the first character, because I'd met someone who I just thought she just seemed like a 16-year-old who'd experienced too much, and I just thought that was an interesting. I only met her extremely briefly, but she captured my imagination. And then, of course, I thought of her having, well, not of course, but I did think of her having an older brother, and then Marty came about. So it was really Claudia and Ian. And then Marty, and really Marty, of course, had to be the center of it all, because I didn't think I could write a teenage voice, and I didn't think I could write certainly a male's voice. So that's kind of how that all came about. But in terms of the people around her, I think that a lot of them are these new people in her life, for example, Ian and Claudia, are completely different to the people that she's had in her life previously. So completely different to her father and her mother, but also different to her friend Kate. And so they show, I think, a different way of being, and a different way of a different type of family. And Ian is very protective of his sister Claudia, who's moved in with him. So I think for him, there's a sort of a guardianship component to that, but also also trying to make amends for having, not having looked after her from birth, knowing the household she was growing up in. So I think there's this sort of sense of guilt that motivates him in a lot of cases with Claudia. And I just think that's an interesting dynamic.
There's so much to unpack there. There's such because I'm glad you've kind of delved into Claudia a little bit, because Claudia really becomes a place for Marty to try and rediscover what love is. Or I think because Claudia has had. She's so young, but she has been marked by life already due to the circumstances, particularly surrounding her mother, and where she sits with Ian is complicated. Where she sits, and then as a result, Marty kind of sees it as an opportunity to try and reconnect in some way, shape, or form. I don't know how. We won't discuss the ending. We'll try and keep it as spoiler free as we can, ending wise. Because these characters and how their stories dovetail and unfurl is one of the reasons why I love the book in the first place. And long and the short of it to any reader is go and buy it. But for me, it was very much it was a book I kind of also needed, because it often kind of bringing it back to kind of where I grabbed it at the top is the value of personal growth and self-love. And then how that comes into conflict with the responsibilities, not only taking responsibility for actions that you have done in the past in terms of how you have treated other people, but also the responsibilities and obligations you have to other people. And that is not just in the case of Marty, it's also in the case of Ian and how he treats and how he looks after to Claudia.
Yeah.
Did this book? I often like to think that books teach you a lot as a writer. You sit on themes and ideas and mull with them and write with them and play with them and have a conversation and strike up relationships with these themes. Do you have an answer to that question from this book, or is it just as complicated and as messy as it is, and that is the answer?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I did find that, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways, to me, Ian and Claudia, and even Ian and Marty, and the way they are together, to me, that represented perhaps a more genuine or a more true, no artifice. You know, it is what it is, and it's not pretty, but that's kind of the nature of it. So yeah, I think I don't know how much I learnt from it as such, but I think that's sort of how I sort of found it came out on the page. I think was that, yeah, this they represent a different world in some ways to the world that she had with, say, Kate, and with her first husband Richard and what have you. It's a very different world, and I did like that contrast and the fact that it impacts on the nature of relationships. Really, that context can have a real influence. So, and it's the reason that Claudia is there in some ways in the first place with Ian. You know, she's someone who could easily fall between the cracks, and really is so vulnerable that her only option is to really go to her brother, who is basically one of the only people who could look after her. So, yeah.
It is such an amazing book, and to any readers, I honestly recommend you check out Ordinary Human Love, because I think you've described it well there. It is what it is. It is how it is, and I think that's the closest answer that you're ever going to get to the question of what is ordinary human love. And it's a fantastic examination of a universal topic with in that all of us in the human condition experience. I want to ask you a little bit. You're welcome. It's a beautiful book. You actually should be really proud of it.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a little bit about your journey to publication now, if I can, because I mean, I'm assuming, of course, having done a lot of writing before your debut, you were quite familiar with that process. You go through the editing, you go through, putting it into, into a collection. You kick things around with publishers, and you kick things around with the editors, and that collaborative nature, and I could go on. But what particularly made me interested, because I often do like to look at, the craftsmanship of how the hell did they do this, and this, is that you have, as we've been alluding to throughout this podcast, is that there's been a bit of a dance with a lot of these characters, and the different stories that they go through. And I just thought to myself, how hard that must have been to put together with your editor.
Yeah, I guess it's the nature of a novel, isn't it? You can have so many different strands, so many different storylines and what have you, and that makes it, I think, richer. I mean, obviously not to the point of it being confusing, but just where the different storylines, I guess, bounce off each other, or reflect each other.
What sort of process did you kind of come to with your editor in terms of, like, making sure that because what was really good was that the key strength of the story is that everything felt so believable and in the moment, which it should be with those, because you're dealing with such big, you're dealing with those emotions, those themes, and you're with those characters in that difficult place. What was it like kicking it around with your editor and going, you know what, we've got to try this in this particular moment, and this particular moment, and how does this apply to this later, etc., etc.?
Oh, I see. Yeah, interesting. I mean, the thing is, so it hadn't actually, when it did go to Ultimo Press, and then when they accepted it, it actually didn't change vastly from what I'd sent to them to what was produced. I mean, it did in some ways, in some key ways. For example, more interiority on Marty was needed, but essentially all the plot, everything else was largely acceptable. I mean, obviously there were some little things that needed changing, and but really, yeah, there wasn't a lot that changed. So I think for me, a lot of it was me kicking it around in my own head to get it down on the page. Yeah. So.
Oh my God, that would have been how long? How long was it? Did it actually? Did it take for you to kind of craft and put this story together? Because that's a lot of volume. That's a lot of kicking around.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that thing, isn't it, where it kind of took 10 years, but I was writing short stories in the background as well, and I was also working as a lawyer, so it was like I wasn't, sitting on my hands. But yeah, it was this novel was tracking along the whole time. But that's why I loved writing short stories, and it was a long time before I even started submitting short stories. But I found that really helped me because writing a novel can take obviously so long, and you sort of sometimes need a shot in the arm, in addition to all the development in the craft that goes with writing short stories. But that shot in the arm of acceptances and what have you really helps, I think, and having little things that you can put out and say, well, this was accepted by this journal or what have you. Because a novel can, I mean, obviously it shouldn't take that long, but I think for a first novel, like, you're kind of learning how to write a novel, so it's not necessarily a slam dunk, let's tap something out and it's done. So yeah.
On the subject of first novels, what's next for you? Is there another story that you're kicking around in there somewhere? Is there another one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the frightening thing is that the first one took 10 years, but the second, I've written 2 more actually since. So that's good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. So just looking to refine and get those, hopefully finding a home in the world. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to see what happens next. How exciting!
Thank you. Thanks.
2 more books potentially. That's I love that. I always love when there's a new project and a new idea that's kind of cooking away in the background, and you're in that process of putting it together. That's always so much fun.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, got to show you've got more gas in the tank, as they say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've now come to the final part of the podcast, where we do a rapid fire question part of our little date with a debut, and I throw a bunch of questions at you, and you give me the first answer that comes to your head. And the first one is around your books yourself, and your own book reading experience. What's your favorite book that you have read in the last 12 months?
Well, it's actually one that I've not long finished, but it was James Salter and Light Years, which was just beautiful. Yeah. I've read his other sort of his works as well, but anyway, that one just really had such a strong impact. It's about a couple, and basically it's about their marriage, but also how it progresses over many years, and he's able to do that within the confines of a novel, and it's just stunning.
All the little intricacies and details and small things that come up between 2 individuals. Yeah, I'm a sucker for stories like that. It's true.
Same.
What is your favorite debut that you've ever read? Like any point in your life?
Yes. Well, I absolutely love Marilyn Robinson, the American writer, and her first book, Housekeeping, is divine. So that was published in like 1980. It took her many years before she wrote another book, and then of course she followed up with I think it's a Pulitzer Prize winning Gilead. So but Housekeeping. And
that goes to show that like you do. Like you do, and it goes to show that like you can come out with an absolute banger, and then the next one just take it may be several years between the next one, but sometimes it is worth the wait. If it's
that's right.
It's the right story.
That's right.
You meet Marty in a lift. She has manifested into the physical world, exists with you, and with all of the knowledge that you have of her, you meet her in a lift, and you've got time for one question to ask her.
Oh,
what is
God. Oh God! I don't know what I would say to her.
Would you just give her a hug?
Why'd you do it? Yeah, I think I would. I feel like I really know her. So I'd probably just say, "Can I give you a hug?" and say thanks. I can't think of anything that I want to ask. Yeah.
The self or others?
What's that? The self
Like,
or others?
The self? The focus on the self or focus on others?
Oh, well, I know what it should be. I know it's meant to be focus on others. Yeah, like, okay, since having a child, and she's now 12, I recognize well and truly that it's not about me, and it's about her, and it's about her life. And yeah, I think that was, for me anyway, a real reality check in terms of no self-absorption allowed. And yeah, let's grow up. Not that everyone needs that, of course, but that's what happened for me. So yeah.
Love it. And our final question, our very last question. Again, as we've highlighted throughout the whole thing, talking about this book, there's been talking about the value one places on things, how that comes into conflict with others. At least my own interpretation of it. What's the meaning of life, in your opinion?
So appropriate for a quick fire round. Fire round.
I know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at it. So there's work and there's love, I think. And I think like I don't think there's any meaning as such in life or to life. I think it's kind of what you make of it. And so with work, I think it's about doing things that have value for you and meaning, and where you use your talents and you just try and contribute something to the world, whatever that may be. And in that way have satisfaction. But of course, it's the old love aspect where all that people want is to be loved and love in return. So really to love and be loved on this earth, I think, I mean, between those two things, I think it's probably the best or closest thing to a meaning that I can think of.
You know, like, that's the reason why I like to ask this question of authors, because sometimes I get a really good answer like that, and that is great.
Thank you.
Like, just a lot of structure to it. I could honestly chat to you all day, Melissa. I really could.
Same.
But it's been a hell of a lot of fun chatting with you about this amazing book. And thank you so much for creating it. Thank you so much for bringing these characters into the world that we can all read and enjoy. And for everyone listening, you can get a copy of Ordinary Human Love right now in the description of this podcast, published by Ultimo Press. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you soon!